Corrine, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the January 21st, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. As always, thank you for joining us today. The highlights under business and finance are: U.S. stocks slumped and Treasuries sold off after Trump stepped up his campaign to take over Greenland and threatened new restrictions on trade with Europe should he not get his way. The global economy is set to grow faster than previously expected, but could falter if trade barriers rise again and geopolitical conflicts intensify, the IMF said. Netflix posted a 29% increase in profit hours after the company sweetened its deal to buy Warner Brothers, Discovery Studios, and HBO Max streaming business with an all-cash offer. Anthropic chief executive Dario Amodei predicted a future in which AI will spur significant economic growth, but could lead to widespread unemployment and inequality. United Airlines expects earnings to jump this year, with its more expensive seats and loyalty program outperforming standard ticket sales. Total Energy said higher oil and gas production will help soften the financial hit from weaker prices as scrutiny of the sector's balance sheets intensifies. Novo Nordisk is running ads that riff on Apple's Get a Mac campaign from 2006 to 2009 to try to distinguish Ozempic from other GLP-1 drugs taken for type 2 diabetes. GSK agreed to acquire biopharmaceutical company RAPT, R-A-P-T, for about $2.2 billion to bolster its respiratory, immunology, and inflammation portfolio. Citigroup hired former Paramount executive and longtime media banker Alex Burkett to run its media division. The picture on today's front page shows a woman with the Greenland flag holding it before a crowd of adults and children. And that caption reads, "A crowd greeted Greenland's Foreign Minister Vivian Molsfeldt at the Nuuk airport Tuesday on her return from talks in Washington." The headline, "Trump's threats to allies stir worry U.S. has lost its way. Insults, tariffs have Davos attendees sensing a break in the international order," by Yaroslav Trofimov, Davos, Switzerland. President Trump is showing up for an annual gathering of the global elite here in the Swiss Alps, swinging a wrecking ball at the international order. Trump insists he will take possession of Greenland from NATO ally Denmark by force if he has to. Ahead of his trip, he posted an image portraying him lecturing European leaders in front of a map in which Greenland, Canada, and Venezuela are emblazoned with the stars and stripes. On Thursday, he plans to unveil what he is calling a board of peace that aims to supplant the United Nations and be led by him in perpetuity. The reactions from many U.S. allies and partners, some of them aired in public, many of them still only expressed in private, is stark. Trump's America seems to have lost its mind. The unfolding break is profound, and to many outside the U.S., Washington's behavior defies any rational explanation. The tone in Europe has hardened in recent days after Trump announced punitive tariffs against European nations that sent troops for exercises in Greenland. Even far-right and nationalist parties, courted by the Trump administration as an alternative to centrist politicians on the continent, have voiced outrage and called for retaliation. Carl Bildt, the former Prime Minister of Sweden, who now co-chairs the European Council on Foreign Relations, Tuesday described Trump's social media post with the map as a Nero warning, a reference to the infamous Roman emperor blamed at the time for burning down the city. Trump's message to the Norwegian Prime Minister that I no longer feel an obligation to think purely of peace because he hadn't been given the Nobel Peace Prize shows a serious problem with the U.S. President's judgment, said Bernard Guetta, a French member of the European Parliament. Ettore Secchi, a former Secretary General of the Italian Foreign Ministry, said Trump has made clear his desire to blow up the international system and summed up the situation by saying, the strategic choice for Europe is whether it is able to talk to Trump while keeping a gun on the negotiating table. Senator Lindsey Graham, Republican from South Carolina, a Trump ally, also attending Davos, said in an interview that a lot of people think Trump is destroying the old order. Good, it didn't work. He said he had little patience for European hand-wringing and was confident that the issue of Greenland would be resolved to everyone's benefit. We are not going to transfer title under a force of arms threat, but the idea of finding a way to bolster Greenland's capabilities and to have more control by us is coming together, he said. Enough with the Greenland drama. It's all going to work out. European leaders have promised a united response to Trump's threat to impose new tariffs on several European countries if he doesn't get Greenland. The European Parliament has put on hold a trade deal with the U.S. that was negotiated last summer. That means that unless the standoff is resolved, tariffs on some 93 billion euros, $109 billion, in U.S. goods will come into effect next month, with more painful moves, such as sanctions on U.S. tech companies, also under consideration. Our response will be unflinching, united, and proportional, European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen said in Davos, warning about a dangerous downward spiral in the transatlantic relationship. President Emmanuel Macron of France and several other European leaders turned down Trump's invitation to join the World Board of Peace, a body that, according to the draft charter, would be presided over by him for life, and that would, in essence, replace the current UN. According to the charter, decisions by member states would be binding only if Trump approved them, and he would have sole authority on picking a successor. Nations that have accepted the invitation include Belarus and Middle Eastern monarchies. Trump, who plans to establish the board in Davos on Thursday, reacted to Macron's refusal by saying he would impose a 200% tariff on French wines and champagnes. There is, so far, a divergence between nations like France that push for maximum response and argue that Trump only recognizes force. Countries such as Italy and the UK that think the crisis can be resolved through negotiations, and others like Germany that are somewhere in the middle. Based on conversations in Davos, however, the desire to accommodate Trump appears to be on the wane, especially as European security officials grow convinced that he might actually use force to conquer Greenland, a semi-autonomous part of Denmark. While the deployment of Danish, French, and other European troops to Greenland this month was officially billed as exercises to protect the Arctic island from Russia and China, the main intent was to create deterrence by raising the political and military cost for any U.S. invasion, a European official said. Canada, too, is growing increasingly alarmed by Trump's designs. There is a non-zero probability that Canada's sovereignty could be violated, and if Greenland's sovereignty is violated, then we could be next, a Canadian lawmaker said. The outcome of any U.S. military action in Greenland would be catastrophic, warned President Gitanas Nausėda of Lithuania. It would be the end of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, he said, and it would probably be the best news for Russia. Unfortunately, Europe has to be strong. Europe has to be united. Other articles from the front page follow. Tariff turmoil returns rattling markets. Greenland dispute, president's warning sends stocks, bonds, and the dollar down. By Hannah Aaron Lang and Sam Goldfarb. Trade turmoil is back on Wall Street. Stocks slumped on Tuesday after President Trump stepped up his campaign to take over Greenland and threatened new restrictions on trade with Europe should he not get his way. The Nasdaq Composite slid 2.4% in its worst day since October. The U.S. dollar retreated. The yield on the 10-year Treasury, a key gauge of borrowing cost, climbed to its highest level since August. Gold, seen as a haven asset during times of geopolitical or economic uncertainty, soared to records. The moves interrupted a long calm in markets, raising the specter of the so-called Sell America trade, a dumping of U.S. and dollar-denominated assets that briefly racked markets after Trump unveiled plans for sweeping global tariffs early last year. Trade deals and carve-outs have helped stocks recover since, with indexes hitting record after record, and the Dow Jones Industrial Average and the S&P 500 notching highs just last week. But the prospect of conflict over Greenland reignited fears that tit-for-tat levies could hurt corporate profits and slow economies around the world. This brings back the fluidity of tariffs, and it's not just for economic reasons, said Brad Long, Chief Investment Officer at WealthSpire. That throws all the cards back on the table. The Dow Industrials fell around 870 points or 1.8%. The S&P 500 dropped 2.1%, snapping a streak of 67 trading sessions without a 2% decline. Germany's DAX shed 1%, while the Pan-European Stock Europe 600 retreated 0.7%. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Goldman's top lawyer presents an Epstein problem. Executive told others he was formulating contingency plans for Catherine Remler to leave Wall Street Bank after disclosures. By Anna Maria Andriotis. When Catherine Remler, a top Washington lawyer with an elite pedigree, joined Goldman Sachs in 2020, she disclosed to top executives a connection that didn't appear on her LinkedIn page, Jeffrey Epstein. But it's what Goldman didn't know about her association with the notorious sex offender, details that have become public in the stream of documents released from Epstein's estate that now looms over Remler and the bank. Remler told Goldman's leaders when they hired her that she had business dealings with Epstein when she was a white-collar defense attorney at Latham and Watkins. It would later become public she met with Epstein dozens of times and exchanged friendly emails for years. It turned out she was in the courtroom when Epstein was arraigned after his arrest on sex trafficking charges in 2019, and Epstein listed her as one of the executors on his will as recently as January 18, 2019. Epstein removed her name before he died on August 10, 2019, while he was in prison awaiting trial. The extent of the relationship has drawn scrutiny inside Goldman Sachs, where the 54-year-old lawyer is general counsel and a top advisor to CEO David Solomon. The drumbeat of disclosures about Remler's ties to Epstein have triggered internal and external reviews, which are expected to continue if more information comes to light. Netflix sweetens deal, posts strong earnings, by Joe Flint and Isabella Simonetti. Netflix posted a 29% increase in profit on Tuesday, just hours after the company sweetened its deal to buy Warner Brothers, Discovery Studios, and HBO Max streaming business with an all-cash offer aimed at keeping rival bidder Paramount at bay. The all-cash deal of $27.75 a share replaces Netflix's previous cash and stock deal. The revamped offer comes as Paramount continues pushing its own all-cash offer for all of Warner Discovery. The value of Netflix's offer remains $72 billion. Warner and Netflix said they expect the new structure to enable Warner shareholders to vote on the deal by April. The change could help sway some shareholders who might be weighing the two companies' agreement against Paramount's offer. Netflix co-CEO Greg Peters said in a statement, "The revised agreement demonstrates our commitment to the transaction and accelerates the process for Warner shareholders." Netflix stock has dropped about 15% since its deal with Warner was announced. The streaming company's shares fell about 5% in after-hours trading on Tuesday. Hotel guests get too much of a view. Proper bathroom doors are a thing of the past. By Katie Dighton. First, they came for the closets. Then they took the bathtubs. Now hotels are stripping away the only thing separating us from animals, the bathroom door. Guests are waving goodbye to the luxury of a fully closable, opaque barrier between the restroom and bedroom, clicking in to find sliding barn doors, curtains, strategically placed walls, and other replacements that aren't as proficient in the art of noise and smell containment. In some cases, they're not even good at hiding the view. You couldn't see the fine details, but you could see everything else, said Denise Milano Sprung of the frosted bathroom door of the hotel room she shared with her husband at the Calgary Airport Marriott. I've been married for 25 years. I love my husband, but I don't want to see him use the restroom. The humble door can look like a money pit. Closing off an often windowless room to natural light means guests will run up energy bills and leave maintenance with more light bulb changing work. Concrete and wood are expensive. Door handles jam and break. The Americans with Disabilities Act requires a door frame wide enough for a wheelchair. Many of the early modifications had drawbacks. Hotel architects installed pocket doors that don't require space to swing inward or outward, but have mechanisms that are costly to maintain. Curtains get dusty. Sliding barn doors have gotten more popular, but they can be unreliable closers. The next front in the movement: can we design a room that doesn't have bathroom doors at all? Said Bjorn Hansen, adjunct professor at New York University's Jonathan M. Tisch Center of Hospitalities. Some hotels have been moving the sink and shower into the bedroom and enclosing the toilet in glass or placing it in cubby-like space, which helps make the room look more spacious, Hansen said. Minnesota Democratic officials subpoenaed by Sadie Gurman. The Justice Department on Tuesday sent subpoenas to Governor Tim Walz and 5 other Democratic officials in Minnesota, escalating an investigation into whether they sought to obstruct the Trump administration's immigration operation in the Twin Cities, people familiar with the probe said. The subpoenas were also sent to the offices of the state's Attorney General, Keith Ellison, Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey, St. Paul Mayor Kelly Herr, and officials in Ramsey and Hennepin counties, one of the people said. Investigators are seeking records as part of an investigation into whether the officials conspired to obstruct or impede the surge of thousands of immigration agents into the blue-leaning area. The Department of Homeland Security has called it the largest operation in its history. Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers were deployed en masse to Minnesota on the heels of a welfare fraud scandal in which most of the people convicted have been of Somali descent. ICE's presence in the state has grown in size since protests erupted over the killing this month of 37-year-old Renee Nicole Good by an agent in Minneapolis. People familiar with the Justice Department's probe have said it is examining whether the Minnesota officials obstructed ICE's work, at least in part, through public statements they made. Walz and Frey have called the investigation an intimidation tactic meant to threaten them for speaking out against the crackdown. Just hours after Good was shot, Fry demanded that ICE get the F out of the city. Walz has called the agent's deployment organized brutality against the people of Minnesota by our own federal government. The Justice Department has also sought to send additional prosecutors to Minnesota to handle immigration cases as well as those stemming from the widespread demonstrations. Israel begins to destroy UN facility. East Jerusalem move is latest blow to agency that aids Palestinian refugees. By Feliz Solomon and Anat Peled, Tel Aviv. Israeli authorities began tearing down structures Tuesday on a United Nations compound in Jerusalem, escalating a battle between the government and the main agency tasked with providing assistance to Palestinian refugees. Israeli security forces entered the compound at around 7 a.m. and forced security guards on the site to leave before bringing in heavy machinery and tearing down structures, said Jonathan Fowler, a spokesman for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, or UNRWA. Bulldozers tore down what appeared to be temporary structures in the compound, according to video shared by Israel's far-right National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. Israeli police were working to clear and destroy the compound, he said. The complex has been largely vacant for a year when laws limiting its operations took effect. The new laws barred the agency from Israeli territory, severed its ties with Israeli officials, and effectively revoked Israel's recognition of its diplomatic status in the country. Israel's foreign ministry said Israel owns the compound in East Jerusalem. UNRWA says Israel has no right to enter the complex without permission because the UN Charter enshrines diplomatic immunity for its premises, also backed by the UN's top court. The demolitions are the latest blow to UNRWA, whose work has been severely curtailed since the new laws took effect. Right-wing Israeli politicians have been at the forefront of the crusade against the agency. The latest attack comes at the start of an election year. Israel's campaign against UNRWA escalated in 2024 when the government accused the agency of having systemic ties to terrorist groups. Israel says the agency looked the other way as its infrastructure in Gaza was exploited by Hamas, which built tunnels and command centers under schools and other civilian buildings run by the agency. UNRWA denies systemic links to terrorist groups. The Hoosiers are champions. Football will never be the same, by Jason Gay. An underdog turned behemoth edges Miami in the final to complete a historic 16-0 campaign. You are living in a world in which the Indiana Hoosiers are your college football national champions. I'm not sure how to explain how crazy this is. It's like going down to the basement and finding the cat singing opera and folding laundry. No, that's wrong. Indiana football winning is much crazier than that. I checked the final score late on Monday, just before midnight. Hoosiers 27, Miami 21. We've all watched Indiana's ascent for 2 years now. That thrilling 11-2 campaign in 2024. But the summiting is hard to process. This astonishing climb by one of college football's most misbegotten programs. Please understand, Indiana wasn't put here to do this. This was a basketball school that played football as a way to get to the basketball season. The football Hoosiers had a handful of good times here and there, but mostly it was a century plus of suffering, a Big Ten punchline, an easy W for the opposition. How rough was it? Indiana hasn't won a bowl game since 1991. Now it has finished a single season in which it went undefeated in the Big Ten, won the Big Ten championship over Ohio State, and then via a 12-team playoff, the Rose Bowl over freaking Alabama, the Peach Bowl, I'm acting like these bowls are still a thing, over Oregon, and finally the title game, which, why not, was played on the home field of its lower-ranked opponent. This team began the season with longer odds than a lobster in a restaurant tank, traveled more than a Dylan roadie, endured so many post-game ceremonies their thumbs have calluses from lifting trophies, and now mercifully can get some rest and their coach a cold one. Their 16-0 record, a sturdy case as one of the finest seasons of all time. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Continuing the article from yesterday, Black America needs a moral rejuvenation. Stop whining about racism, honor Martin Luther King's legacy, and confront the enemy within. By Robert L. Woodson, Sr. Black America must declare a one-year moratorium on whining about racism. Martin Luther King Jr. warned us against this temptation. In his final book, he wrote, "It is not a sign of weakness, but a sign of high maturity to rise to the level of self-criticism." The enemy is most visible in the epidemic of black-on-black violence. In a single year, more black lives are destroyed by this violence than were killed by the Ku Klux Klan in 4 decades of terror. Yet such stories rarely dominate national headlines. Civil rights leaders and politicians remain conspicuously silent, waiting instead for the next police shooting or racial controversy they can exploit for media attention and moral posturing. Call out this silence and you will be accused of racism, bullied into retreat by those who profit from outrage while ignoring the suffering in their own backyard. This silence isn't compassion, it is cowardice. The same moral blindness fuels corruption. Consider the massive pandemic relief fraud in Minneapolis, where nearly $250,000 meant to feed hungry children was stolen. Here is the truth we must confront. Poverty doesn't produce moral decay. Deprivation doesn't produce depravity. It never has. I remember growing up in the 1940s and 50s when black communities were sanctuaries from white violence, not danger zones for our own children. Moral discipline, faith, and strong families were our first line of defense. Then came the transformation. The civil rights movement dismantled segregation and expanded opportunity, an extraordinary achievement. But over time, leadership shifted from moral suasion to political patronage. Welfare replaced mutual aid. Bureaucrats replaced neighbors. Racial grievance replaced dignity. Poor blacks were told they could be redeemed only by outsiders, while a growing civil rights industry prospered by managing their despair. As conditions deteriorated, blame shifted outward. Failures of policy and leadership were blamed not on incompetence or corruption, but on vague, systemic forces rooted in history. This narrative absolved leaders of responsibility and stripped communities of agency. It also created the conditions that made massive fraud and exploitation inevitable. Victimhood is not liberation. It is a leash. Racism is real and still exists, but it can't be the only explanation for every failure or the excuse for every crime. A community can't be healed by lies, and it can't be saved by slogans. No child was ever rescued by a hashtag. True empowerment requires moral clarity. It requires the courage to tell the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable and even when the guilty look like us. Every dollar wasted on failing programs and fashionable activism is a dollar stolen from grassroots leaders who are already healing their neighborhoods from within. These leaders don't need excuses. They need honesty, accountability, and support. In this new year, Black America must stop outsourcing blame and start reclaiming responsibility. Confronting the enemy within isn't weakness, it is strength. It is the first step toward renewal. If we fail to do this, no enemy outside our community needs to defeat us. We will have already done the work for them. Our future depends on whether we have the courage to rise to the level of self-criticism King demanded, and the moral discipline our ancestors exemplified. Scripture is unambiguous. Judgment begins in the house. A people can't cry out for deliverance while refusing correction, or ask God for justice while excusing wrongdoing in its own ranks. If Black America is to rise, it won't be by shouting louder about oppression, but by returning to the moral discipline that once sustained us. Truth over excuses, repentance over resentment, and responsibility over grievance. Only then can we rightly demand justice from the world, having first restored it among ourselves. Mr. Woodsum is founder and president of the Woodsum Center and author of Lessons from the Least of These. From the editorial page, NATO is the Board of Peace. Trump's new coalition couldn't do better than the Atlantic Alliance. President Trump's latest notion is a Board of Peace that he is inviting much of the world to join. He may hold a signing ceremony as early as this week when he holds court at the World Economic Forum in Davos. We're all for peacemaking, but this idea could use some fleshing out. Mr. Trump's original idea for the board was to supervise the later phases of his Gaza peace plan. Various countries with an interest in Gaza would send representatives to rebuild the territory into a livable place, if not a new Riviera. The board will have its hands full disarming Hamas even before it gets to rebuilding Gaza. But inviting Tony Blair, the former British Prime Minister, as a member of the executive committee was an inspired choice. Mr. Trump would be the chairman, and the board was approved in November by the United Nations Security Council. Yet, as the invitations to join have rolled out, Mr. Trump seems to view its mandate as going far beyond Gaza. Countries around the world with little direct interest in Gaza have received an invitation. They include Canada, Australia, India, Hungary, and Argentina, which are far afield from Gaza. Even Russia has received an invitation to join, and so has Belarus, Vladimir Putin's partner in imperialism. Maybe Mr. Putin should have to stop waging a hot war in Ukraine and a cold war against Western Europe before he joins anything with the word peace in the title. Moscow is studying all the details of the proposal and hopes to contact Washington to clarify all the nuances, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said. So war is now peace? A draft of the board's charter posted by the Times of Israel says there is the need for a more nimble and effective international peace-building body and calls for a coalition of willing states committed to practical cooperation and effective action. Is Mr. Trump thinking about an alternative to the UN? A coalition of democracies unrestrained by Russian or Chinese vetoes at the UN Security Council could do some good. But then there already is a coalition of the willing. It's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which has kept the peace in Europe for 75 years and has also helped in the Middle East and in anti-terror efforts. Maybe Mr. Trump should try to preserve NATO rather than blowing it up over Greenland. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. From the opinion pages. Greenland is Trump's white whale. He needs therapy more than the U.S. needs to own the island to ensure its defense. By Holman W. Jenkins, Jr. If Donald Trump's foolishness over Greenland gets out of hand, recall the U.S. Senate has ratified numerous treaties codifying U.S. duties under the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which, under the U.S. Constitution, are now the supreme law of the land. NATO's Article 1, for instance, makes it illegal for the U.S. to exercise the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. The UN Charter, adopted by the Senate 89-2 in 1945, giving it also the force of U.S. law, bans the U.S. from issuing the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity of a non-offending member state. In 2023, for the benefit of any adjudicating judge, Congress further expressed its will by preventing a president from withdrawing from NATO without a 2/3 Senate vote. This isn't international law. Mega types, it's U.S. law. A Trump order to occupy an otherwise peaceful and unthreatened Greenland would likely be illegal 6 ways from Sunday. The U.S. military would obey it. The Supreme Court would enjoin it. Congress might promptly remove such a president through impeachment. These realities, widely unmentioned in the current moment, probably aren't lost on Mr. Trump. The whole kerfuffle fits better under the heading, "Why is he throwing his presidency away?" Look at his tariff and immigration overkill, his sagging approval ratings, likely GOP defeat in the House midterms, his probable impeachment soon after. The mysteries of personality will always be with us. Mr. Trump can turn 180 degrees, yet never admit doubt or a mistake. But his strangest quality may be the pleasure he gives himself by constantly talking about his desired triumphs, as if he has already achieved them. If it sounds like we're in the hands of a neurotic, what kind of people do we think become president? But something is also different today. The conservative thinker Yuval Levin shrewdly notes that both parties, in fact, are in a groove where they confess winning for a minute with winning. In this game of non-stop cynicism, bereft of ideas or any long-term purpose, Mr. Trump is up by 1. Stop the steal delivered him back to the presidency. The Russian collusion hoax. The grift by which Democrats sought to return a senile Joe Biden to office, not so effective. The result is the one Mr. Levin notes, and this column pointed to last week. Mr. Trump dominates his age like no president since FDR. In politics, all winning is temporary, of course. All political careers, to borrow the famous observation, end in anticlimax, if not humiliation. That is, unless the hero is lucky enough to die at his moment of supreme triumph. For Mr. Trump, that moment was his improbable 2024 return, from which all was bound to be downhill. At 79, he may even be flirting with cognitive decline for all we know. Yet wrapped up in his peculiarity has been a knack for rubbing America's face in realities. He summons an FDR-like strategic cool at unlikely moments. The better part of discretion may actually be to settle for leaving our SOB in charge of Venezuela. Using words alone to draw a red line against the mass slaughter of regime opponents in Iran may be wiser than making a large U.S. investment to control an outcome we can't control. Since Home Rule in 1979 and passage in 2009 of the Greenland Self-Government Act, the Danes and their Greenland subjects have furled themselves in lip service to independence, now an uncomfortable fact as a new strategic order is emerging. Independence has remained more talked about than acted on, due to Greenland's fiscal dependence on transfers from Denmark, but China could fan the embers at any moment with promises of infrastructure riches and bribes to Greenlanders. American presidents have concerned themselves with the island's strategic value since the Andrew Johnson administration. In response to Trump maw-mawing, the Danes and Greenland last week formally shelved further moves toward separation. This is the right path, whereas Mr. Trump's demand for ownership is simultaneous, superfluous, and obnoxious. Greenlanders and Denmark can have their cake and eat it. U.S. defense investment in their territory without having to swear allegiance to the United States of Trump. This is the same basis, after all, on which all of Europe has related to NATO for 75 years. Mr. Trump's preoccupation with owning Greenland, like his Nobel Prize obsession, would be best addressed elsewhere, in therapy. I'm perfectly serious. Once he started unburdening himself of his insecurities and traumas, he probably wouldn't stop for a week. The world and the U.S. would be better for it. As my bonus for saying so, my inbox will soon bear witness to an important corollary of a Trump-like political figure: the willingness of weaker personalities to subordinate themselves to the neurotic needs of stronger ones. Human history itself is my witness. The same reality also underlines the oldest advice in politics: never fall in love with a politician, which apparently every generation must learn anew. How to destroy Trump's presidency. Invading Greenland would drive Europe into China's arms, by Tom Rogan. In an unprecedented move, some of America's closest North Atlantic Treaty Organization allies are conducting military exercises in Greenland with a focus on deterring U.S. aggression. It takes a lot for the Europeans to agree even on joint statements during a crisis. That they marshaled to conduct military exercises shows the depth of their fear. Their message to Mr. Trump is clear: attacking Greenland means attacking Europe and the end of the transatlantic alliance. For the U.S., that wouldn't be the end of the cost. True, the prospect of Trump's ordering an attack to seize Greenland is highly remote, and it's even less likely such an order would come to fruition. It would likely provoke a mass resignation of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in protest of an unjustified attack on a close ally. The U.S. military knows that the ultimate foundation of its powers isn't guns, but America's moral credibility and shared strategic interest with allies. Only the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs would likely remain in office, and even then, only to uphold the sacred principle of civilian control over the military. The order would spark immediate action from bipartisan majorities in Congress for much the same reason. Polling suggests Americans would overwhelmingly oppose any attack. Mr. Trump would extinguish his political capital in a single moment. The GOP's already fleeting midterm election prospects would evaporate. The age of MAGA would come to an icy and abrupt end. Quite abrupt, because even assuming his order to use force was followed, officers are obliged to illegal orders. Congress would likely move to block funding or otherwise restrict the use of military force in short order, and for good reason. Mr. Trump deserves immense credit for getting NATO allies to spend more on defense. Still, this alliance provides outsized value, both in economic and security terms, to America. Denmark exemplifies this. This small country lost the U.S. population equivalent of 2,152 soldiers fighting alongside America in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those honored dead attest to how Mr. Trump's casually hostile rhetoric and the historically incontinent war cries from some on social media are manifestly antagonistic to U.S. interest. America is exceptional because more than any other nation or political organization in history, it has defended democratic sovereignty simply because it is the right thing to do. If the U.S. invades Greenland, it'll catapult us into a world in which might makes right. Morality aside, ordering an invasion of Greenland would likely leave Xi Jinping the greatest beneficiary. Beijing would offer Europe an easy proposition: stay quiet on Taiwan and human rights, support China's political supremacy, and we'll encroach on your territory only through key investments in industry capture. Europe would quickly acquiesce to China, moved by the only message that a U.S. invasion of Greenland could convey. You can pick the predictable bully in Beijing or the unpredictable one in Washington. Mr. Rogan is a national security writer for the Washington Examiner. The Pepper and Salt cartoon takes place on the moon, where an astronaut has just landed and he's outside investigating the terrain. And all of a sudden, a huge rock-type object comes flying toward him. And the astronaut says, "Come on, we just got here." You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the January 21st, 2026 issue of the Wall Street Journal. We read from the Wall Street Journal every Monday through Thursday at 11 p.m. Your reader has been Corrine. Thank you for listening, and stay warm.